It was the last day of the semester at Kingsworth Academy, the kind of elite private school where tuition cost more than most people's yearly salary. Marble hallways, towering oak doors, and the faint scent of polished brass gave the place an air of untouchable privilege. For most students here, life was a conveyor belt of opportunity. Prep school, Ivy League, corporate boardrooms. But for 19-year-old Daniel Hartford, the only son of billionaire real estate magnate Charles Hartford, even privilege felt like a prison. Daniel had failed every major test that year. Math, science, literature. His grades were a battlefield of red ink. Teachers whispered in the staff lounge that the boy had everything yet nothing at all. The Hartford name shielded him from expulsion, but it couldn't shield him from the shame that came each time a test was handed back. Charles Hartford was a man of numbers, mergers, and steel-eyed negotiations. He had built his empire from nothing, or so he claimed and expected his son to carry the same fire. But when Daniel brought home yet another failing report, Charles's patience thinned. That evening, in the glass and steel penthouse that overlooked the city skyline, his voice thundered against the high ceilings. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? For our family? Every headline is ready to call you the spoiled son who can't even read a room, let alone a textbook." Daniel stared at the floor. Words wouldn't come. Not because he didn't care, he did, but because for years, he had lived in the shadow of a man who measured worth by success alone. The next morning, while the rest of the school rushed to catch the final assembly before winter break, Daniel lingered in the empty halls. His father's voice still echoed in his head. That's when he saw him, Mr. Elijah Brooks, the school janitor. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in his late 60s. Elijah was pushing his cart down the corridor, humming a tune older than the building itself. His hands were weathered, his uniform neatly pressed, and his eyes held a quiet fire. "Morning, young Hartford," Elijah said with a slight nod. Daniel forced a smile. "Morning, Mr. Brooks." Elijah paused, studying the boy's slouched shoulders. "You've got that look," he said, leaning slightly on his broom. "What look?" Daniel asked. "The one that says I've been beaten before I even started." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "Guess you're right." Elijah's gaze softened. "Sit a minute," he said, gesturing to a bench by the lockers. "I've got a story for you." Daniel hesitated, but something in Elijah's tone made him obey. "I came to this country with $2 in my pocket," Elijah began. "Worked the fields first, then the factories. Didn't have much schooling. But I learned one thing real quick. You can fail 100 times. But if you keep the same mind each time, you're gonna fail the 101st too." Daniel frowned. "So, what's the point?" "I've been trying. Nothing changes." "That's the thing, son," Elijah said. "Trying the same way isn't trying, it's repeating. You've been learning for your teachers, for your father, for everyone but yourself. That's why it never sticks." Daniel stared at the floor. "And what am I supposed to do? They tell me I'm lazy, dumb, distracted. Maybe they're right." Elijah leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Don't you ever take someone else's measure of you as the truth. I've cleaned these halls for 30 years. I've seen boys from the bottom rise to own the boardroom, and boys from the top fall so far they couldn't see daylight. The difference? One secret. Learn for your life, not for their approval." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "That's it?" "That's the start," Elijah said. "But you've also got to change how you learn. Break it down small. See the pattern. Stop thinking of tests as judgment and start seeing them as a puzzle to solve." The conversation stuck with Daniel long after Elijah returned to mopping the floors. That night, in the silence of his massive room, he opened his math book. Not because his father would demand it, but because he wanted to see if Elijah was right. He took one problem and worked on it slowly without looking at the clock. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the weight of failure pressing down on him. The next morning, Daniel found Elijah again, this time in the storage room organizing supplies. "You were right," Daniel said, almost shyly. "When I looked at it differently, it made sense." Elijah smiled, revealing deep lines of age and resilience. "That's because you stopped seeing it as a test and started seeing it as yours to master. You've got to own your learning, Daniel, and if you want, I'll help you." And so began their unlikely partnership. Every afternoon when the halls emptied and the noise of privilege faded, Daniel sat with Elijah in a quiet corner of the school library. Elijah never lectured like the teachers did. He asked questions, drew diagrams, told stories. He'd compare math problems to fixing a leaky pipe, literature to listening to the rhythm of a gospel song, history to tracing the roots of a family tree. Slowly, concepts that once seemed impossible began to make sense. But it wasn't just the academics. Elijah spoke to Daniel about life, about growing up in a segregated South, about doors slammed in his face, about the countless times he was told he wasn't smart enough, worthy enough, human enough. Yet here he was, a man whose dignity had never been for sale. People think the janitor's job is to clean up messes, Elijah once told him. But I've been cleaning up lies my whole life, lies about what a man like me can be. And now I'm cleaning up one more lie, the one you've been telling yourself. For the first time, Daniel felt like someone saw him, not the last name, not the failures, but him. Weeks passed. Daniel's confidence grew. He began passing his quizzes, then astonishingly his midterms. The staff noticed. Even the headmaster raised an eyebrow when Daniel handed in an essay that was, for once, coherent and insightful. But when Charles Hartford heard of his son's sudden improvement, he wasn't impressed. He was suspicious. One night over dinner he asked, "Who's been helping you?" "Some tutor I don't know about." Daniel hesitated. "Mr. Brooks." "Mr. Brooks?" Charles repeated, confused. "The janitor?" "Yes," Daniel said firmly. His father laughed, short, sharp, and cold. "You're telling me a man who pushes a mop around? This school is the reason you're suddenly passing." "That's absurd." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's not absurd. He's the first person who's actually taught me how to think." Charles' face darkened. But before he could respond, Daniel added, "Maybe if you listened to him for 5 minutes, you'd learn something too." That night, tension hung over the penthouse like a storm cloud. But Daniel didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't ashamed of who he was or of who was helping him. What Daniel didn't know was that his father's disbelief was about to set in motion events that would test not just his progress in school, but his courage to stand up for the man who had given him more than any classroom ever had. The following Monday, Charles Hartford arrived at Kingsworth Academy unannounced. He stepped out of his Blacktown car in a tailored suit, the kind that made people move aside without a word. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he marched toward the administrative wing. He found Elijah Brooks in the east hallway, methodically polishing a brass railing. "You're Mr. Brooks?" Charles asked, his voice low but edged with authority. Elijah straightened. "That's me. Can I help you, sir?" "I'm Daniel Hartford's father. My son tells me you've been teaching him?" Elijah studied the man for a moment, then nodded. "If that's what he told you, then yes." Charles took a step closer. "Why, you're a janitor. You're paid to keep the school clean, not to meddle in my son's education." The words hung heavy in the air. Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "With respect, Mr. Hartford, I didn't meddle. Your son came to me looking for a way to learn. I gave him my time because I saw a young man who needed more than grades. He needed someone to believe in him." Charles's eyes narrowed. "You think you know my son better than I do?" Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "I know what I've seen. And what I've seen is a boy who was drowning, not because he couldn't swim, but because no one ever taught him how." The conversation could have ended there, but pride wouldn't let Charles walk away. "Look, Mr. Brooks, I appreciate your good intentions, but I can afford the best tutors in the world. I don't need a custodian playing teacher." It was meant as a dismissal. But Elijah didn't move. "Sir, in my life, I've cleaned offices where billionaires sign contracts worth more than I'll make in 10 lifetimes. But I've also learned that money can't buy a person the will to care. I'm not here for your approval. I'm here because your son asked for help and I gave it." Charles opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was something in Elijah's voice, an unshakable dignity, that left him momentarily without a retort. He turned on his heel and left without another word. That night, Charles confronted Daniel. "I went to your school today. Spoke to your friend." Daniel looked up from his desk. And I still don't understand why you think this is appropriate. You're a Hartford. You should be learning from the best, not from a black janitor." Daniel's voice was sharper than he intended. Charles froze. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Daniel shot back. "You think his job makes him less. But Dad, he's taught me more about thinking, about believing in myself than you ever have." And it's not just about school. It's about life. Charles' face hardened. You're being dramatic. Daniel stood, his voice trembling with frustration. No, I'm being honest. You measure people by their bank accounts. He measures people by their effort. You talk about building an empire. He's been building character, one student at a time for decades. You just never noticed because you never looked. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Charles saw his son standing not as a boy, but as a young man willing to defend someone else's worth. Over the next weeks, Daniel's improvement continued. His teachers remarked not just on his grades, but on his engagement. He was asking questions, challenging assumptions, and even helping classmates understand difficult material. But one afternoon, a rumor spread through the school like wildfire. Elijah Brooks was being let go. Officially, it was budget cuts. Unofficially, staff whispered that certain parents had complained about inappropriate involvement with students. Daniel didn't believe it for a second. He knew exactly where the complaints had come from. He found Elijah in the janitor's closet, packing away his things. You're leaving? Daniel's voice cracked. Elijah sighed. Seems so. School says they're restructuring. Daniel shook his head fiercely. This is because of my dad, isn't it? Elijah placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Son, life's full of closed doors. I've had more slammed in my face than I can count. But the measure of a man isn't how many doors open for him. It's how he keeps walking anyway. Daniel swallowed hard. I'm not letting this happen. That evening, Daniel confronted his father again. They're firing him. You can't let this happen. Charles didn't look up from his tablet. Daniel, this isn't your fight. Yes, it is, Daniel said firmly. Because he fought for me when no one else did. If you let this happen, you're proving every stereotype he's had to live with his whole life. That no matter how good a man is, someone with money and influence can take away his dignity. For the first time, Charles saw something in his son's eyes that startled him. Conviction. Not the petulance of youth, but the resolve of someone who had found a cause worth standing for. The next morning, Charles requested a meeting with the headmaster. It was brief but pointed. By the end of the day, Elijah Brooks' position was secure. The official statement cited community appreciation for his decades of service. When Charles told Daniel, his son didn't thank him. Instead, he said, "You did the right thing. I hope you understand why it matters." Later that week, Charles found himself in the east hallway, the same place he'd first confronted Elijah. This time there was no tension, only a quiet acknowledgement between two men. I misjudged you, Charles said. I thought teaching was about credentials, not connection. Elijah gave a small smile. We all misjudge sometimes. The question is whether we keep doing it. That afternoon, Daniel sat in the library with Elijah, working through a history chapter. But this time something felt different. It wasn't just student and mentor anymore. It was the continuation of a truth. Elijah had been living his whole life. That dignity, respect and belief in another person's potential can change more than just grades. By the end of the school year, Daniel not only passed every exam, he earned a scholarship for a university program in education. When asked why, he simply said, "Because I want to be for someone else what Mr. Brooks was for me." Elijah never took credit. He kept pushing his cart down the hallways, humming the same old tune. But every time he saw Daniel walking with purpose, head held high, he knew the secret he'd shared had taken root, not just in the boy's mind, but in his life. And in a quiet way that was worth more than any degree, any title, or any fortune.